I think more shock and dauntingness was more the feeling I felt. But it was, the thing is, it's...
For years, the royal family believed the most dangerous threats came from outside palace walls. But what if the greatest betrayal had already slipped inside? What began as a routine concern surrounding Prince George's safety suddenly exploded into something far darker. Hidden deep within the private quarters of the future king, a discovery would send shockwaves through the monarchy, trigger emergency meetings behind closed doors, and leave Prince William confronting a nightmare he never imagined possible. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It started with whispers. Quiet concerns exchanged between security officers who rarely allowed themselves the luxury of uncertainty. For weeks, subtle irregularities had been appearing around Prince George's private wing. Nothing dramatic at first. A brief signal interruption here, an unexplained technical fluctuation there. Each incident seemed insignificant on its own, the kind of issue that could easily be dismissed as an aging system or a minor equipment fault. Yet as the reports accumulated, a troubling pattern began to emerge, one that even the most experienced protection officers struggled to explain. Inside palace security circles, unease slowly replaced confidence. The disturbances were happening too frequently and too precisely. Systems that were regularly inspected and constantly monitored were behaving in ways that made little sense. Trusted personnel began quietly documenting incidents, comparing notes, and searching for explanations. At first, most believed the answer would be simple. Technology fails, equipment malfunctions, human error happens. But the deeper they looked, the harder it became to support those comforting conclusions. The situation escalated when William received an alarming briefing from members of his personal protection team. These were individuals whose judgment he trusted without hesitation, professionals who understood the gravity of every word they delivered. What they presented was not a theory or a rumor. It was a growing collection of concerns that suggested something inside the palace was not functioning as it should. The future king listened carefully, expecting a practical explanation to emerge by the end of the discussion. Instead, every answer seemed to create new questions. What troubled him most was the possibility that the disturbances were connected to George's living quarters. The thought was impossible to ignore. Security surrounding the young prince was among the most extensive in the world. Layers of protection existed specifically to prevent unauthorized access. Yet small details kept appearing that suggested someone, somewhere, might have found a way through safeguards that were believed to be impenetrable. For William, the issue immediately became personal. This was no longer about technology. It was about trust, safety, and the protection of his son. As investigators quietly examined the area, they uncovered signs that something within George's bedroom had been altered. The modifications were subtle, almost invisible to anyone who was not specifically searching for them. That discovery changed everything. What had been treated as a technical concern suddenly began to resemble something far more deliberate. Palace insiders, who learned fragments of the investigation, started fearing the possibility of a major security breach. Conversations became guarded. Questions multiplied. The atmosphere behind palace walls grew increasingly tense. Many expected William to delegate the matter and allow specialists to handle it. Instead, he made a decision that surprised even those closest to him. He would examine the situation personally. The reports were becoming too serious, the implications too dangerous, and the stakes too high to rely solely on second-hand information. If someone had truly gained access to George's private space without detection, then the monarchy was facing a threat, unlike any it had anticipated. And as William moved closer to the truth, a growing sense of dread followed every new discovery, because somewhere beneath the uncertainty lurked the terrifying possibility that the intruder had not only entered unnoticed, but had been there far longer than anyone realized. But when William entered the room himself, he would uncover something so shocking that the concern instantly became a full-scale royal emergency. The object was small enough to fit into a hand, easy to overlook, nearly impossible to detect. Yet the moment it was removed from its hiding place, everything changed. What William believed would be a routine inspection transformed into a chilling realization that someone may have been watching one of the most protected children in the world. And worse still, nobody could immediately explain how the device got there. The moment William stepped deeper into the investigation, the atmosphere surrounding the palace shifted from concern to outright alarm. What had begun as a search for answers about unusual technical disturbances suddenly revealed something no one had prepared for. Hidden within what appeared to be an ordinary decorative fixture inside Prince George's bedroom was a device so carefully concealed that it had escaped notice despite countless security checks. Its discovery did not bring relief. Instead, it unleashed a wave of fear that swept through the royal household with astonishing speed. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The implications were too disturbing to process. Security personnel immediately recognized that this was not some forgotten piece of equipment or harmless technological oversight. Specialists examining the device quickly reached a conclusion that sent a chill through everyone involved. The camera had not arrived there by accident. It had been deliberately installed. Someone had planned this. Someone had gained access. And someone had succeeded in placing surveillance equipment inside the private space of the future king. The realization hit William with extraordinary force. Throughout his life, he had lived under intense scrutiny, but this was different. This was not about him. This involved his son. George represented the future of the monarchy, and the possibility that an unknown individual had been secretly observing him crossed a line that even seasoned palace officials struggled to comprehend. Those closest to William later sensed a profound shift in his demeanor. The concern that had driven the investigation suddenly hardened into determination. He was no longer searching for explanations. He was hunting for the truth. Within minutes, emergency protocols were activated. George's private quarters were sealed off, access permissions were suspended, and a lockdown was imposed around the entire area. Senior staff members found themselves facing questions they could not answer. How had this happened? Who had approved access? Why had no alarms been triggered? The palace had spent generations refining its security systems, yet now those systems appeared vulnerable in ways nobody wanted to admit. As word quietly spread among senior officials, panic began taking hold behind closed doors. Every conversation seemed to circle back to the same terrifying possibility. If the camera had been operating for weeks or even months, what had it captured? Nobody knew. Investigators immediately began exploring whether recordings had been transmitted elsewhere. The fear was not simply that surveillance had occurred. The fear was that sensitive material might already exist beyond palace control, circulating in places they could neither identify nor reach. William responded by demanding the most extensive forensic sweep ever conducted within the residence. Every room, every fixture, every electronic system became subject to scrutiny. Teams worked relentlessly, searching for signs that the camera might not be an isolated discovery. The deeper they looked, the more unsettling the situation became. What initially appeared to be a single breach was beginning to resemble something far larger. Palace officials who had first hoped for a simple explanation were now confronting a far harsher reality. This was not a technical malfunction. It was not an administrative oversight. It was a direct assault on the security of the royal family. And perhaps most frightening of all was the fact that nobody could yet identify the person responsible. The camera's existence proved that someone had penetrated layers of protection once considered unbreakable. That realization lingered over every meeting, every report, and every attempt to restore calm. Because as technicians began examining the device, an even more disturbing question surfaced: who had access to the room in the first place? The list was supposed to be reassuring. Instead, it became terrifying. Every person who had entered Prince George's private area over recent months was suddenly under scrutiny. Trusted aides, household staff, security personnel, even individuals who had served the family for years found themselves facing questions nobody expected. And with every name reviewed, the circle of suspicion grew smaller and far more dangerous. As technicians continued analyzing the hidden camera, investigators turned their attention toward what many believed would provide the answers they desperately needed: the access records. Every movement into Prince George's private quarters was documented. Every authorized entry was supposed to leave a trace. On paper, the process appeared flawless. The palace had spent decades refining security procedures designed specifically to prevent a situation like this. Yet as investigators began reviewing the records, confidence quickly gave way to concern, and concern soon evolved into something much more unsettling. The first few names raised little alarm. Long-serving aides, trusted members of staff, and security personnel whose loyalty had rarely been questioned appeared exactly where expected. But as the review expanded, strange patterns began emerging. Certain individuals appeared in places investigators could explain, yet at times they could not fully verify. Others seemed to have entered areas without corresponding records showing how they arrived. The inconsistencies were subtle at first, but together they painted a picture that nobody wanted to acknowledge. What made the situation particularly disturbing was the reputation of those now under scrutiny. Many had spent years serving the royal household. They had attended important moments, protected family secrets, and earned levels of trust that few outsiders could comprehend. Yet suddenly, trust itself became part of the investigation. No one was automatically above suspicion. No one could be excluded simply because of history or loyalty. The discovery of the camera had changed the rules, and everyone understood it. As teams worked through months of data, another troubling issue emerged. Some records appeared incomplete. Certain entries seemed to be missing altogether. Investigators found unexplained gaps where information should have existed. In a system built around precision and accountability, those gaps were impossible to ignore. The possibility that records had been altered, removed, or manipulated began circulating among senior officials. That theory brought with it an entirely new level of fear. If someone had interfered with access logs, then the breach was not merely physical, it was systemic. William listened to briefing after briefing, but the answers never seemed to align. One explanation contradicted another. Assurances that should have provided comfort only deepened his frustration. Every report contained fresh uncertainty. Every lead seemed to end with another unanswered question. For a man already grappling with the realization that his son's privacy had been violated, the lack of clarity became increasingly difficult to tolerate. The investigation was progressing, yet somehow the truth felt farther away than ever. The strain began affecting relationships throughout the palace. Long-standing loyalties that had survived countless challenges suddenly came under pressure. Quiet disagreements turned into serious disputes. People who had once trusted each other without hesitation now questioned motives, decisions, and explanations. Behind closed doors, accusations were never spoken directly, but suspicion lingered in every conversation. The atmosphere became heavy with uncertainty. Meanwhile, whispers of an insider threat spread through royal circles. Nobody wanted to say it aloud, yet many were beginning to fear the same possibility. The hidden camera may not have been placed by an outsider breaking in from beyond palace walls. It may have required help from someone already inside. That possibility terrified senior figures more than any external threat ever could. If true, it would mean the danger had been living among them all along. Adding to the pressure was the growing fear that news of the investigation might eventually become public. Palace officials understood how explosive the story would be. Questions about security, trust, and internal failures could damage public confidence in ways that would take years to repair. Yet even as they focused on containing the crisis, investigators were uncovering evidence that suggested the situation was becoming far larger than anyone had initially imagined. Yet the investigation would take an even darker turn when specialists uncovered evidence suggesting the camera was only part of a much larger operation. What if the hidden camera was never the true objective? As investigators dug deeper into the palace's internal systems, they discovered clues pointing towards something much bigger than simple surveillance. Every answer seemed to create three new mysteries: Every cleared suspect revealed another unexplained detail, and soon, the fear gripping the palace was no longer about what had been found, but what remained hidden. The theory that the camera was an isolated incident began to collapse almost as quickly as it had formed. Investigators who were initially focused on identifying the person responsible for placing the device soon found themselves confronting a much broader and far more disturbing possibility. The hidden camera was no longer being viewed as the center of the crisis. Instead, it was beginning to look like a single piece of a puzzle that nobody yet understood. And with each passing day, that puzzle grew darker. The breakthrough came when security specialists expanded their examination beyond the physical device itself. What they discovered inside the palace's digital infrastructure immediately raised alarm. Strange traces appeared within systems that should have been tightly controlled. Unusual patterns surfaced in areas where no unusual activity should have existed. Individually, the findings seemed minor. Together, they painted a picture of someone operating with remarkable patience and sophistication. The realization was chilling. Whoever had orchestrated the operation might have been planning it for far longer than anyone had imagined. As analysts continued following those digital trails, evidence began pointing toward possible coordination beyond palace walls. The possibility of outside involvement transformed the investigation overnight. What had once been treated as a breach of security was now evolving into something that resembled a carefully constructed network. Investigators could not yet identify its full scope, but the signs were impossible to ignore. There were too many connections, too many unexplained coincidences, and too many questions that refused to disappear. The response was immediate. Emergency security reviews were ordered across multiple royal residences. Teams moved from one property to another, examining systems, records, and communication channels with unprecedented urgency. Every location connected to the royal family suddenly became part of the investigation. Officials feared that focusing solely on George's bedroom might blind them to a larger threat hiding elsewhere. The search expanded rapidly, and with every expansion came new concerns. For William, the emotional weight of the crisis grew heavier by the day. One question refused to leave his mind. Was George truly the only target? The possibility that someone had focused specifically on his eldest son was horrifying enough. Yet the deeper investigators dug, the harder it became to dismiss broader fears. If one child had been placed under surveillance, what about the rest of the family? What about Catherine? What about Charlotte and Louis? Those questions lingered in every conversation, creating an atmosphere of constant unease. Concerns surrounding the family's communication systems only intensified those fears. Experts began scrutinizing vulnerabilities that had previously received little attention. Private channels, internal communications, and secure networks all came under examination. Nobody wanted to imagine that additional information might have been compromised, but nobody could confidently rule it out either. The uncertainty became its own form of torment. Meanwhile, anxiety spread throughout the palace. Staff members who had once gone about their duties with confidence now found themselves looking over their shoulders. Trust continued to erode. Rumors multiplied. Every unexplained event suddenly seemed significant. Every forgotten detail became a potential clue. The crisis was no longer confined to investigators and security teams. It was affecting everyone connected to the institution. Behind closed doors, royal advisors began discussing scenarios they would have once considered unthinkable. They debated reputational damage, long-term security risks, and the consequences of a public revelation. Some feared the monarchy was facing one of its most dangerous internal challenges in modern history. Others worried that the truth had not even begun to surface. And as the investigation expanded beyond a hidden camera and into something far more complex, William found himself confronting a realization that changed everything. As the scope widened, William faced a realization that transformed the crisis from personal fear into a battle for the monarchy's future. Few people ever witnessed Prince William truly lose his composure. But according to insiders, the discovery inside George's bedroom triggered a level of anger unlike anything palace staff had seen before. The future king was no longer simply a royal figure managing a crisis. He was a father confronting the possibility that his child's privacy, safety, and trust had been violated in the most unimaginable way. By the time the investigation expanded beyond the hidden camera and into the possibility of a wider operation, something inside William had changed. For days he had listened patiently to briefings, reviewed reports, and weighed competing explanations. But patience was beginning to run out. Every new revelation seemed to expose another failure. Every unanswered question deepened the sense that those responsible for protecting his family had somehow allowed the unthinkable to happen. The crisis was no longer a puzzle to solve. It had become a deeply personal battle. Those present during internal discussions described a level of urgency that transformed the atmosphere throughout the palace. William demanded answers, not theories. He wanted accountability, not reassurance. The discovery inside George's room had shattered the assumption that the family was protected by an impenetrable system. If someone had managed to penetrate those defenses, then every promise of security suddenly felt fragile. That realization fueled a determination that quickly spread through every level of the investigation. Emergency meetings began dominating palace schedules. Day after day, senior advisors, security chiefs, and administrative officials were called into discussions that often stretched for hours. What made those meetings different was the tone. This was not routine crisis management. The stakes were far too high. The future king wanted to understand exactly how such a breach had occurred and why warning signs had not been identified sooner. Each briefing carried enormous pressure because everyone understood what was hanging in the balance. Senior officials soon found themselves facing difficult questions. Procedures that had once been accepted without challenge were suddenly scrutinized in extraordinary detail. Assumptions that had guided palace operations for years were no longer treated as reliable. William pushed relentlessly for clarity, often encountering conflicting explanations that only intensified his frustration. The deeper the investigation went, the more obvious it became that long-standing confidence in the security system had been built upon vulnerabilities nobody had fully appreciated. At the center of it all stood Catherine. While much of the public attention focused on William's response, Catherine became deeply involved behind the scenes. For her, this was not a discussion about institutional failures or political consequences. It was about protecting her children. The possibility that George had been watched without his knowledge struck at the heart of every parental instinct. As concerns expanded to include Charlotte and Louis, her determination grew stronger. Family safety became the focus around which every decision revolved. The emotional strain began spreading beyond the immediate investigation. Staff members felt it. Advisors felt it. Even routine operations started reflecting the pressure. Conversations became shorter. Decisions carried heavier consequences. Trust, once taken for granted, now had to be earned repeatedly. Some officials quietly feared that major personnel changes might become unavoidable. Others worried that removing individuals without conclusive evidence could create even greater instability. Yet everyone understood that the status quo could not continue. What made the situation particularly painful was the collapse of assumptions that had existed for years. The royal family had invested enormous effort into building systems designed to protect future generations. Those systems were supposed to provide certainty. Instead, they had delivered doubt. The contrast was devastating. The institution that symbolized continuity suddenly found itself confronting profound uncertainty. As discussions intensified, one priority rose above every other concern. Protecting the family became more important than reputation, tradition, or protocol. Every decision was now measured against a single question: would it keep George, Charlotte, Louis, and Catherine safe? Yet, even as William focused his energy on securing the palace from within, investigators following separate leads were beginning to uncover information that threatened to expand the crisis far beyond anything anyone had anticipated. But while William searched for answers inside the palace, investigators were quietly uncovering clues that pointed far beyond its walls. The more investigators uncovered, the less this looked like the work of a lone individual. Hidden connections began appearing between technical evidence, suspicious movements, and unexplained communications. What first appeared to be a single hidden device now hinted at a coordinated effort operating in the shadows. And if those fears were true, the monarchy was facing a threat far more organized than anyone had imagined. As investigators widened their search beyond palace grounds, the entire direction of the case began to shift. What had started as an internal security breach was rapidly transforming into something far more complex and far more dangerous. The evidence emerging from digital analysis, access records, and communication reviews was no longer pointing toward one isolated actor. Instead, it suggested a web of connections that seemed to stretch beyond the royal household itself. Every new discovery reinforced the same unsettling possibility. Someone had not simply penetrated the palace. Someone may have built an operation around it. The first clues appeared almost by accident. Analysts comparing technical data from different stages of the investigation noticed patterns that should not have existed. Certain communications appeared linked, despite originating from entirely separate sources. Timing irregularities surfaced repeatedly in places investigators had not previously connected. Individually, none of these findings proved anything. Together, however, they painted a troubling picture. The camera in George's room no longer looked like the beginning of the story. It looked like one small part of a much larger plan. That realization prompted investigators to examine whether multiple individuals could have been involved. The question changed everything. A lone intruder was one threat. A coordinated effort was something entirely different. Suddenly, every unexplained action, every missing record, and every unusual movement acquired new significance. Teams began reviewing information that had previously seemed irrelevant, searching for hidden links that might reveal how deep the operation truly extended. Financial records soon became part of the inquiry. Nothing immediately incriminating appeared, yet several transactions and unexplained connections raised enough concern to warrant deeper scrutiny. Communication logs proved equally troubling. Experts discovered interactions that could not be easily explained through ordinary palace operations. The details remained incomplete, but the pattern was unmistakable. Something unusual had been happening beneath the surface, and nobody could confidently determine where it began or where it ended. As these findings accumulated, security specialists issued increasingly urgent warnings. Their concern was no longer focused solely on the hidden camera that had triggered the crisis. They feared additional vulnerabilities remained undiscovered. If one device had been successfully concealed, what was preventing others from existing elsewhere? The possibility haunted every discussion. Palace officials could not escape the growing fear that the camera might be only the first discovery rather than the last. William responded by authorizing an unprecedented expansion of the investigation. Resources were increased. New specialists were brought in. Areas previously considered secure were subjected to fresh examination. He understood that limiting the search could be catastrophic. If the threat extended beyond what investigators had already uncovered, then every delay increased the risk. The search had to continue regardless of how uncomfortable the answers might become. Inside the palace, rumors spread faster than official information. Staff members quietly exchanged theories about hidden networks, outside collaborators, and unseen figures operating beyond the reach of investigators. Most of those theories lacked evidence, yet their existence revealed how deeply fear had embedded itself within the institution. Confidence was disappearing. In its place came suspicion, uncertainty, and a growing sense that the crisis was still unfolding rather than approaching resolution. The emotional toll became impossible to ignore. Advisors worked under relentless pressure. Security teams faced scrutiny unlike anything they had experienced before. Senior officials worried not only about what investigators might discover, but also about what would happen if the public learned how vulnerable the palace had become. The tension reached levels few could remember witnessing. Every briefing carried the potential for another devastating revelation. Yet even amid that atmosphere of anxiety, investigators remained convinced that the most important discovery was still ahead. Hidden within the growing mountain of evidence were clues that refused to fit established explanations. Those clues would soon force the entire investigation into uncharted territory and challenge assumptions that had guided the search from the very beginning. Then came the discovery that changed the entire investigation and forced the palace to prepare for a potentially devastating revelation. For days, investigators had chased fragments of information. Then suddenly, everything converged. A breakthrough uncovered evidence that appeared to connect multiple unexplained events previously dismissed as unrelated. What emerged was a timeline that painted a disturbing picture, one suggesting the camera's installation may have been carefully planned long before anyone noticed something was wrong. The breakthrough arrived at a moment when many inside the palace were beginning to wonder whether the investigation would ever produce clear answers. Weeks of analysis had generated mountains of information, but very little certainty. Clues appeared, then vanished. Leads seemed promising, before collapsing under closer examination. Yet buried beneath the confusion was a pattern that nobody had fully recognized. Once investigators assembled the pieces in the correct order, the entire crisis looked different. What emerged was not a random collection of incidents. It was a sequence, a chain of events, stretching back months before the hidden camera was discovered. Technical irregularities that had once seemed insignificant suddenly aligned with unusual access records. Unexplained communication activity matched periods of heightened concern within the palace. Even small incidents previously dismissed as administrative errors began fitting into a broader timeline. Investigators realized they were no longer looking at isolated anomalies. They were looking at preparation. That realization sent shockwaves through the leadership overseeing the inquiry. The camera had not simply appeared. According to the evidence now taking shape, its placement may have been preceded by careful planning, deliberate testing, and a series of actions designed to avoid detection. Every new connection strengthened that theory. The operation appeared methodical, patient, calculated. The possibility that someone had spent months preparing for a breach of this magnitude transformed the investigation from alarming to deeply frightening. As analysts continued reconstructing the timeline, additional suspicious incidents became linked together. Events that once seemed unrelated now appeared connected by hidden threads. Small security concerns, unusual technical behavior, gaps in documentation, strange communication patterns. Individually, none had triggered a major response. Together, they suggested a coordinated effort unfolding gradually beneath the surface of palace life. The deeper investigators looked, the clearer the pattern became. William received the findings during a confidential briefing that many insiders would later describe as one of the most significant moments of the entire crisis. Until then, much of the investigation had focused on discovering what happened. Now attention shifted toward understanding how long it had been happening. The distinction was crucial. The new evidence suggested that the breach was not a sudden event, but the culmination of a process that may have been developing for months. For William, the implications were devastating. The briefing also forced palace leadership to confront a reality they had been reluctant to accept. The crisis was larger than anyone had initially believed. What began as a security concern involving a hidden camera had evolved into a challenge that threatened confidence in the institution itself. Questions about oversight, accountability, and vulnerability could no longer be avoided. Every discussion now carried consequences that extended far beyond the immediate investigation. At the same time, fears of public exposure intensified dramatically. Senior figures understood how explosive the story could become if details emerged beyond palace walls. The possibility of hidden surveillance involving the future king would dominate headlines around the world. More troubling still was the risk that partial information could leak before investigators fully understood the truth. That fear created deep divisions among advisors. Some argued for greater transparency, Others insisted absolute secrecy remained essential. The disagreement only increased tensions, already running dangerously high. As pressure mounted, calls for decisive action grew louder. Officials demanded stronger security measures. Investigators pushed for broader authority. Advisors urged immediate reforms. The sense of urgency became impossible to ignore because every passing day raised the risk of further revelations. Yet even as leaders debated their next move, the evidence continued expanding, revealing implications that stretched far beyond the original discovery. And as the evidence continued to build, the palace faced a choice that could permanently alter the future of the royal family. The hidden camera itself was shocking enough, but the true crisis was what it represented. Trust had been shattered. Security systems once considered untouchable had failed. Relationships forged over decades now stood under suspicion. And as William confronted the aftermath, the question facing the monarchy was no longer who planted the device. It was whether the institution could recover from a betrayal that struck at the very heart of its future. By the time the investigation reached its final stage, the palace no longer resembled the institution that had existed before the discovery inside Prince George's bedroom. The hidden camera had exposed far more than a security breach. It had exposed weaknesses, assumptions, and vulnerabilities that many believed could never exist within one of the most protected royal households in the world. The crisis had evolved into something much larger than a search for answers. It had become a test of resilience, leadership, and trust. William understood that restoring confidence would require more than identifying those responsible. It would require change. Immediate change. Sweeping security reforms began moving through every level of palace operations. Long-established procedures were reviewed from the ground up. Systems that had once been accepted without question faced unprecedented examination. Nothing was considered too important to challenge. Nothing was considered too traditional to reform. The future king had reached a conclusion that many around him could no longer deny. The old way of doing things was no longer enough. The most significant changes centered around George's protection. Security arrangements were completely restructured. Access protocols became more restrictive. Oversight increased dramatically. Every measure reflected a painful lesson learned through the investigation. What had happened could never be allowed to happen again. Yet beneath those practical changes lingered a deeper emotional reality. No security system, no matter how advanced, could immediately restore the sense of trust that had been lost. That loss extended throughout the palace. Culture itself came under scrutiny. Officials were forced to confront uncomfortable questions about accountability, communication, and institutional complacency. For years, confidence in established systems had created a sense of certainty. Now that certainty had vanished. The crisis forced everyone to reconsider assumptions they had rarely questioned before. Some welcomed the changes, others feared the consequences. But nobody could pretend the institution remained untouched. At the same time, intense debates unfolded among senior figures regarding how much of the truth should ever become public. Some believed transparency was essential for rebuilding confidence. Others warned that revealing too much could damage the monarchy's reputation for years. The discussions became increasingly difficult because neither side possessed easy answers. Protecting the institution and confronting reality seemed to be pulling leadership in opposite directions. While those debates continued, Catherine focused on something equally important: preserving stability within the family itself. Throughout the crisis, attention had naturally centered on investigations, evidence, and security failures. Yet behind every headline stood a family living through profound uncertainty. Catherine's priority remained protecting George, Charlotte, and Louis from the emotional consequences of events they could not fully understand. In many ways, her efforts became the quiet foundation, holding everything together while chaos unfolded around them. The contrast facing the monarchy became impossible to ignore. Publicly, the institution projected strength, continuity, and confidence. Privately, leaders wrestled with fears that few could openly acknowledge. Every decision carried consequences. Every revelation threatened to deepen the crisis. The tension between protecting public image and confronting private reality became one of the defining challenges of the entire ordeal. For William, the experience represented perhaps the greatest leadership test of his life. He was no longer simply responding to a security emergency. He was guiding the monarchy through a moment of profound uncertainty. Every action he took would shape not only the outcome of the investigation, but also public confidence in the institution's future. The pressure was immense, yet retreat was never an option. And even as reforms were implemented, questions continued to linger. The investigation may have uncovered critical answers, but some mysteries remained stubbornly unresolved. Certain details never fit perfectly into established explanations. Certain connections remained incomplete. Those lingering uncertainties created a final and deeply unsettling possibility. Perhaps the camera had revealed everything investigators needed to know, or perhaps it had only revealed enough to expose a deeper problem still waiting beneath the surface. The monarchy moved forward, but it did so with caution. The crisis had changed it. Trust would take time to rebuild. Confidence would take time to restore. And while the immediate threat appeared contained, few inside the palace could completely silence the question that now haunted every corridor, every meeting, and every effort to move on. Because even after the camera was found, one haunting question refused to disappear. If someone managed to place a hidden eye inside Prince George's bedroom once, what else inside the palace has yet to be discovered? Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.